This is Module B-4, Objective 5. Describe how the medulla oblongata, pons, and respiratory reflexes control respiration. What's the purpose of respiration? Well, you could say that the purpose of external respiration is to get oxygen and carbon dioxide where they need to go. One of those steps in external respiration is gas diffusion. Where does gas diffusion take place? It takes place between alveolar capillaries and alveoli and peripheral capillaries and peripheral cells. So what happens if gas diffusion is not working the way it should? We need to maintain a homeostatic balance. If gas diffusion is not working the way it should, then we have an imbalance of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if there's some sort of homeostatic imbalance of oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusion, we can try to correct that by locally changing blood flow and oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide delivery as well. Or we can change the depth and rate of pulmonary ventilation or breathing. So these three areas involve local control or local changes being made in order to maintain the homeostatic balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, A right here, peripheral blood vessel carbon dioxide levels, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, cause vasodilation and increased blood flow. Remember, vasodilation means opening up of a blood vessel, and that's going to cause increased blood flow, which means more oxygen being delivered. So that's one way. That's local control. Right here in the lungs, there's coordination of lung perfusion and alveolar ventilation. Lung perfusion refers to how much blood flow there is, and alveolar ventilation refers to how much airflow there is. What's the major purpose of the lungs? We're trying to diffuse gases in and out of the bloodstream. In order for that to take place, there needs to be adequate blood flow matching adequate airflow. If there's an area that has a lot of blood flow but not very much airflow, will we be able to move gases efficiently? No, we won't. If there's an area with a lot of airflow but very little blood flow or no blood flow, will we be able to diffuse gases efficiently? No, we won't. So the lungs try to shift the blood flow, the perfusion, to match areas where there's a lot of airflow. On the other hand, the lungs try to shift the airflow to areas where there's a lot of blood flow. Finally, the bronchioles, when they have high levels of carbon dioxide, they tend to dilate, they tend to open up, and allows more oxygenated air to those areas. In summary, increased blood flow to areas where there's lots of carbon dioxide and not enough oxygen. That's peripherally, so organs. There's a matching of perfusion and ventilation in the lungs so that we have lots of air where there's lots of blood and not so much air where there's not so much blood, and areas in bronchioles that have lots of carbon dioxide, we open up those airways to allow more airflow and to allow more oxygen to get in and carbon dioxide to get out. Those are all extremely important, but really the focus of this module is number 2 here, changes in the depth and rate of respiration. If we have too much carbon dioxide in the blood or not enough oxygen, we can change the depth and rate of respiration so that we will diffuse more oxygen into the bloodstream and more carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream. So what controls the depth and rate of respiration? We have respiratory centers in the brain that do just that. There are voluntary areas and there are involuntary areas. Remember from last semester that the cerebral cortex is controlling voluntary muscle movement, voluntary behavior. These voluntary areas do affect the brainstem, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and obviously they affect motor neurons. You voluntarily want to breathe more or deeper, you contact your diaphragm via these motor neurons that control the diaphragm. The involuntary areas are located in the medulla oblongata and the pons, the brainstem. Mentioned a little bit earlier, they do have contact with the voluntary areas. We're really going to spend a lot of this module talking about these involuntary areas and how they alter respiratory rate and depth. Alright, we're starting out with the medulla oblongata, respiratory rhythmicity centers, and these are involuntary. They set the pace and depth of respiration. There are two areas, the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. The dorsal respiratory group is also known as DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, VRG. The dorsal respiratory group is only involved in inspiration or inhalation. The ventral respiratory group is involved in both inspiration and expiration. In quiet breathing, what muscles are active? Only the inspiratory muscles. In forced breathing, what muscles are active? The inspiratory and expiratory muscles as well. So the ventral respiratory group is only going to function in forced breathing. The dorsal respiratory group, both quiet and forced. And again, that's because in quiet and forced breathing, there always has to be active inspiration. In quiet breathing, you don't use any muscles in order to expire or exhale, so the ventral respiratory group is not used. Here's a chart that hopefully illustrates the content on the last slide a little bit better. Quiet breathing involves active inhalation or inspiration. And how about exhalation? Passive exhalation. And how about forced breathing? It's active for both. So we have active inhalation and active exhalation. Active again means you're using muscles. Passive means you're not using muscles. For quiet breathing, we can expect active inhalation and passive exhalation. We're going to just be using the dorsal respiratory group. The first step is the dorsal respiratory group becomes active. What muscles does that affect? It affects the diaphragm and external intercostals. After that, inhalation has ended. We're now in exhalation. The DRG is inhibited. What happens to muscles that are involved in inhalation? They relax, and passive exhalation occurs. So in quiet breathing, DRG only. In forced breathing, the DRG and part of the VRG are active. Keep in mind that in forced breathing, you're also using some accessory muscles, not only the diaphragm, not only the external intercostals, but your sternocleidomastoid, your scalenes. If you look back earlier in the PowerPoint, there are some accessory muscles that are listed. They're both active. The muscles of inhalation contract, opposing muscles relax, inhalation occurs. Now, for exhalation, you would expect the DRG to be not active because it's just inspiratory, and the expiratory center of the VRG is active. What's that going to do? It's going to cause muscles of exhalation to contract. Internal intercostals, exhalation occurs. DRG, quiet breathing, forced breathing. VRG, just forced breathing. There are some other important centers that communicate with the respiratory rhythmicity centers in the medulla oblongata. These are known as the apneustic and the pneumotaxic centers. Just know that they modify the output. They're in contact with the respiratory rhythmicity centers. Over here in this diagram, you can see that here's the pons right here. Here is the medulla oblongata. And here's the pneumotaxic center. Here's the apneustic center. Here are the respiratory rhythmicity centers. They are in contact. The syndrome known as SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, might be because of connection problems between the pons and the medulla oblongata. Respiratory reflexes. The DRG, the VRG, the apneustic center, the pneumotaxic center, all of those are in part controlled by respiratory reflexes. These respiratory reflexes will cause a change in the rate and depth of breathing. The first two are particularly important. Chemoreceptors that are responding to changes in chemicals in the bloodstream or cerebrospinal fluid, and baroreceptors that are responding to changes in blood pressure. Chemoreceptor reflexes are extremely important. The respiratory centers are strongly influenced by chemoreceptor input from really three different places. There are chemoreceptors in the aorta. There are chemoreceptors in the carotid arteries, and there are chemoreceptors in the medulla of the brain. The chemoreceptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries are part of what are called the aorta and carotid bodies. They're known as peripheral chemoreceptors. They send their signals to the medulla oblongata via these two cranial nerves. Do you remember this cranial nerve? Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal. Cranial nerve 10, you should know that easily. That's the vagus nerve. They respond to changes in pH or partial pressure of oxygen. The chemoreceptors in the medulla are known as central chemoreceptors, and they're monitoring cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. They're probably the most important. They respond to changes in carbon dioxide and pH. Those changes in carbon dioxide are extremely important. That's why I'm drawing a very thick box around this, not only for this class, but for the future. Carbon dioxide, changes in carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, the most important drive to breathe. You have increased amounts of carbon dioxide, you breathe more. Low amounts of oxygen are important, but carbon dioxide going up, higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide causes you to breathe. Increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide causes increased breathing. So when these chemoreceptors are stimulated, there's an increased depth and rate of respiration. If they're stimulated too much, there may be decreased sensitivity. If someone has chronically high levels of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, eventually the chemoreceptors might not respond as well as they should or at all. This relates to our discussion of carbon dioxide and its importance. Hypercapnia means that there's too much carbon dioxide in the blood. Hypocapnia means that there's not enough. What causes hypercapnia? One cause of hypercapnia, meaning too much carbon dioxide in the blood, is hypoventilation. Hypoventilation means you're not breathing enough. If you're not breathing enough, all that carbon dioxide that's being produced through metabolism, you're not getting rid of it. Abnormally low respiration allows carbon dioxide buildup in the blood. And what will that do? That will stimulate chemoreceptors that will cause respiratory rate and depth to go up. What's a cause of hypocapnia? Hyperventilation. When someone hyperventilates, you have them breathe into a paper bag so they can take back in some of that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is important in maintaining acid-base balance. So if someone is hyperventilating, they're blowing off, they're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide, which throws off their acid-base balance, which we'll talk about in a later module. Here's a diagram that shows chemoreceptor responses to a change in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So more carbon dioxide, what do the chemoreceptors do, and then what's the end result? Over here, this really talks about it. A rise in arterial carbon dioxide stimulates chemoreceptors that cause more breathing. And more breathing means that you're going to lose carbon dioxide and lower the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. The reverse is true. There's a diagram in your book that shows the reverse of this. If there's too little carbon dioxide, basically the reverse happens. You breathe less. But let's say that you do have too much arterial carbon dioxide. Chemoreceptors, specifically in the brain, those central chemoreceptors are going to sense high amounts of carbon dioxide, which will in turn stimulate respiratory muscles, cause an increased respiratory rate. Carbon dioxide is gotten rid of, homeostasis is restored. Baroreceptor reflexes. Remember that baro refers to pressure. These are pressure receptors. These pressure receptors that cause baroreceptor reflexes are in the carotid arteries and aorta. Same places that some of the chemoreceptors are located. So you do have chemoreceptors and baroreceptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries. Those baroreceptors do affect blood pressure. They also have an effect on respiratory rates. If blood pressure drops, that causes respiration to increase, apparently to compensate for that drop in blood pressure and drop in blood flow. If blood pressure goes up, that causes respiration to decrease. Herring-Brewer reflexes. These are two baroreceptor reflexes that essentially prevent overexpansion of the lungs or over deflation of the lungs. There's an inflation reflex that prevents the overexpansion, and there's a deflation reflex that prevents the overdeflation. That's really all that you should know about the Herring-Brewer reflexes. Protective reflexes. If you're exposed to some irritant, whether it be chemical, mechanical, or toxic, if your respiratory tract is exposed to some sort of irritant, that can cause protective reflexes. Some of those include sneezing and coughing. Sneezing and coughing both involve apnea. Apnea is suspended respiration. Also, laryngeal spasm. Remember, the larynx has the glottis, and the glottis can close to close off your lower respiratory system, close off the airway so that foreign substances don't get in. Voluntary control of respiration. Strong emotions can affect respiration, stresses, as well as anticipation of strenuous exercise.